The lemon oil clung to the air in the study, a sharp, clean scent against the cold marble and dark, polished wood. Lena moved with a practiced economy, her cloth whispering over the vast rosewood desk, erasing the day's invisible traces. It was a room built for a man who valued stillness, a quiet so profound it felt heavier than noise. Every object had its place: a single fountain pen, a stack of documents aligned to a perfect right angle, a small, unadorned box of polished mahogany. This was the heart of Julien Lefebvre's empire, a space that felt more like a private sanctuary of power than a place of business. And in this sanctuary, Lena, in her pale blue cleaner's uniform, was a ghost meant to pass through without leaving a mark. In the corner, a small splash of color defied the room's severe monochrome. Her daughter Naomi sat on a plush Aubusson rug Serge had placed there for her, a worn red backpack beside her. At 6 years old, Naomi had a seriousness that mirrored the house itself. Her crayons moved with fierce concentration across the salle, the page, her small brow furrowed. Lena had no choice but to bring her. Her sitter had canceled last minute, a flu tearing through the neighborhood, and the thought of calling in, of inconveniencing the household of a man like Monsieur Lefebvre, was unthinkable. He was more than a boss. He was a force, a presence, felt even in his absence. The city whispered his name in conversations that died when you entered a room, the head of the Lefebvre syndicate. The title was so immense, so cinematic, it felt absurd to connect it to the silent man she sometimes passed in the halls. The door opened without a sound. Lena froze, her hand hovering over the desk. Julien Lefebvre stood there, framed by the doorway. He was not a large man, but his stillness took up all the oxygen in a room. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable. His gaze swept the room, noting her presence with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, before it settled on the small figure in the corner. That's when it happened. Naomi looked up, her wide, dark eyes locking with his. The blue crayon dropped from her fingers, rolling silently across the polished floor. A breath, a moment, suspended in the heavy quiet. Then she scrambled to her feet, her little legs pumping, and ran straight toward the most dangerous man in Paris. Serge, his ever-present shadow, tensed at the door, his hand twitching toward his jacket. Lena's heart stopped. Before anyone could move, Naomi reached him, her small hands grabbing the fabric of his trousers. She tipped her head back, her face alight with a certainty so pure it was terrifying. "You're my father." The words, spoken in a child's clear, high pitch, shattered the silence. They echoed off the paneled walls, a declaration of impossible truth. Everyone froze. Serge's stony expression fractured with disbelief. Lena felt the blood drain from her face, her body turning to ice. Julien Lefebvre did not move. He simply looked down at the small African-American girl clinging to his leg, his face a mask of profound, unreadable shock. Lena's apology was a frantic, whispered torrent of words. "Monsieur Lefebvre, I am so sorry. She didn't mean Naomi. Come here." She lunged forward, her hands trembling as she tried to pry her daughter's fingers from the expensive fabric. But Naomi clung to him, resolute, her gaze never leaving it. Face. Julien didn't look at Lena. His attention was entirely consumed by the child. He, slowly, deliberately lowered his gaze to meet hers. The silence that followed was different from the usual quiet of the house. This was a charged, humming silence thick with questions that had no answers. Lena could feel Serge's stare, burning into her, a mixture of suspicion and utter confusion. She felt like a trespasser, a stain on the pristine surface of this man's world. The drawing Naomi had been working on lay forgotten on the floor. It had slid near the leg of the desk, a splash of vibrant, innocent color in the severe room. Julien's gaze finally drifted from Naomi to the paper on the floor. With a slow, fluid motion that seemed to take an eternity, he bent down, not breaking his stare from Naomi, and picked it up. He held the drawing in his hand, his long fingers careful around the edges. It was a child's rendering of a man, a stick figure really, but with specific, deliberate details. Black hair, a dark suit, and a small silver line drawn next to one of his eyes. A scar. Julian's scar. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. He looked from the drawing to the child. Then, finally, for the first time, his eyes met Lena's. There was no anger in them, not a flicker. There was something else, something deeper, and far more unnerving, a profound stillness, as if a great bell had been struck. And he was, waiting for the vibrations to cease. "It is late," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a command. "Serge will see you out." It wasn't a firing. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a dismissal so absolute it felt like a door being sealed shut forever. Lena finally managed to pull a protesting Naomi away, murmuring apologies that felt thin and useless in the heavy air. As Serge escorted them down the long, silent corridor, Lena didn't dare look back. She could feel Julien Lefebvre's eyes on her, a weight against her skin, him standing alone in a silent study holding her daughter's impossible drawing. We all have those moments, don't we? The ones where the world tilts on its axis, and you can't breathe for the shock of it. Lena's just happened in front of a crime boss. What was the moment that changed everything for you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're holding your breath to see what happens next, make sure you've subscribed. You won't want to miss this. Their apartment was small, but it was warm. It smelled of cinnamon and old books, a world away from the sterile, scentless air of the Lefebvre estate. The walls were a cheerful yellow crowded with Naomi's artwork. Here, Lena was not a ghost in a blue uniform. She was a mother, a woman piecing together a life. Naomi was finally asleep, her small body curled under a patchwork quilt, the red backpack resting on a chair like a faithful sentinel. The quiet of her own home didn't soothe Lena. It amplified the ringing in her ears, the memory of that terrible, echoing silence. She sank onto her sofa, pulling her phone from her pocket, her fingers fumbling as she dialed. Chloe answered on the second ring. "Hey, you. How is the land of sterile opulence?" Lena took a shaky breath. "Chloe, something happened." Chloe's cheerful tone vanished. "What kind of something? Did you break a priceless vase? Did you accidentally use polish on an antique silk rug? Lena, talk to me." "Worse," Lena whispered, the word barely audible. "Naomi." She ran up to Monsieur Lefebvre and called him her father. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Then a shriek. "She what?" "Lena. Lena, are you insane? You took your child to work, to the home of a literal French crime boss, the man who probably has people buried under his perfect parterre garden." "I didn't have a choice. The sitter was sick." Lena pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to block out the image of Julian's face. "The point is, she did it. In front of him. In front of his terrifying bodyguard." Okay. Breathe," Chloe commanded, her own voice an octave higher than usual. "Why? Why would she do that? Does she even know what a father is?" "You know how she is," Lena said, her voice cracking. "Ever since that school project about families, she's been searching. She asks about her dad all the time. Lena's husband, Marcus, had died in a roadside bomb overseas 6 months before Naomi was born. All her daughter had of him were a few faded photographs and the stories Lena told. He was a hero, a ghost, a myth. She's been drawing him," Lena continued, her eyes finding the drawing Naomi had brought home yesterday, taped to the fridge. It was the same man, stick body, dark suit, and the scar, the tiny silver line by his eye. Marcus had a scar, Lena whispered, a realization dawning on her that was so cold it burned. From shrapnel, a little silver line right by his left eye. Just like his. Chloe was quiet for a moment. "Oh, Lena? Oh, honey." So, she saw this man. This powerful, scary man who looks like the drawing of her hero father. And she just put it together in her 6-year-old brain. It made a devastating kind of sense. But that logic wouldn't save her job. It wouldn't erase the look on Julienne Lefebvre's face. She was a cleaner, a nobody, and her daughter had just laid a claim on a man who could erase them from the city with a single quiet word. The next morning, Lena dressed in her uniform with the grim finality of a condemned prisoner. Every button felt like a lead weight. She expected a call, a text from Madame Dubois, the head housekeeper, telling her not to bother coming in. But the phone remained silent. The silence was its own kind of torture. As she walked up the long manicured driveway to the estate, the house seemed to loom larger than before, its classic Haussmann lines feeling less like architecture and more like a fortress. She left Naomi with a neighbor, a knot of plot, dread so tight in her stomach she could barely breathe. She walked through the pros service entrance, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The kitchen was humming with its usual quiet efficiency. Madame Dubois was at point terte, the counter, meticulously arranging flowers in a vase. She looked up as Lena entered, her aged face calm, her eyes missing nothing. She simply nodded, a gesture that was neither welcoming nor dismissive. Monsieur Lefebvre is out for the morning, she said, her voice even. The West Wing needs dusting. That was it. No questions, no accusations, just an instruction. It was a reprieve, but not a pardon. The tension in the house was palpable. The other staff members moved around her with a new, careful distance, their eyes sliding away when she met their gaze. She was marked. She was the woman whose daughter had committed an unthinkable breach of protocol. Serge stood at the end of the main hall, a statue carved from granite. He watched her pass, his expression as unreadable as his employer's. Lena kept her head down, her focus narrowed to the task at hand. Dust the shelves, polish the dust, tables, disappear. Her hands worked on autopilot, her mind replaying the scene in the study over and over. When she returned to the kitchen for a fresh cloth, she saw it. Sitting on the dape corner of the massive steel island was a small porcelain bowl. It was filled with perfect, glistening strawberries, each one the size of a plum. No one was around. The kitchen was empty, but it hadn't been there before. She knew with a certainty that made the hairs on her arms stand up who had left it. It wasn't a gift. It was a message, a question, or maybe a statement. She didn't know which. She only knew it was from him. A silent, deliberate gesture from a man who communicated in silence. She backed away from the counter slowly, her heart hammering a new, more complicated rhythm. This was worse than being fired. This was uncertainty, and uncertainty in the world of Julienne Lefebvre felt infinitely more dangerous. A week passed, then two. Lena was not fired. The terrifying, quiet normality of her job resumed, but with a subtle shift she couldn't name. The space around her felt different, charged with an unspoken awareness, and the ritual continued. Every morning, on the steel counter in the kitchen, a small offering would appear. A perfectly ripe pear. A single exquisite pain au chocolat from a patisserie Lena knew was on the other side of the city. A small carton of the Preisenses Reisen, organic chocolate milk Naomi loved. They were always for Naomi, never for her. They were gestures of immense thoughtfulness performed with the detached precision of a surgeon. Julienne Lefebvre remained a ghost. She would catch glimpses of him, a shadow, passing a doorway, the low murmur of his voice from behind a closed door. But they never spoke. He was an absence that was more present than any person. The fear in her chest began to slowly, cautiously transform into something else. Curiosity. One evening, she was finishing late. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple, the air thick with the smell of rain. Naomi was with Chloe for the procès night. The house was quiet, the staff gone. Lena found herself in the main kitchen, the silence pressing in. On impulse, driven by a restlessness she couldn't explain, she pulled out the flour and butter she'd bought on her way, and she began to bake. It was her own ritual, a connection to her grandmother, to a life before all of this. She worked the dough for biscuits, the familiar, motions of her hands a comfort. The scent of melting butter and rising flour began to fill the vast, sterile kitchen, a warm, human smell that felt like an act of rebellion. My mother used to say that you could tell a person's state of mind by the way they kneaded dough. The voice came from the doorway. Lena jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Julien Lefebvre stood there, out of his usual suit, dressed in simple, dark trousers and a soft gray sweater. He looked younger, less like a monument. He didn't move from the threshold, just watched her. She said, he continued, his voice low and calm. That angry hands make for tough bread. Lena found her voice, though it felt tight in her chest. And what do my hands? Sigh? He was silent for a long moment, his eyes on her flour-dusted fingers. They say, you are patient, he said finally, and that you are a long way from home. He stepped into the kitchen, moving toward the island but keeping a respectful distance. He picked up one of the fresh strawberries from a bowl on the counter, the same kind he'd been leaving out. Naomi, he said, speaking her name as if it were a fragile object. Does she like the fruit? Lena nodded, unable to speak. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. Just the two of them, the sound of the rising wind outside, the warm smell of baking bread. This powerful man, this figure of myth and fear, was asking about her daughter's taste in fruit. She does, Lena managed. Thank you. He simply nodded, his gaze holding hers for a fraction too long. Something was happening in the space between them. A quiet acknowledgement of a truth they couldn't yet name. It was terrifying, and it was the first time in a very long time that Lena hadn't felt completely alone. When a man who controls an entire city notices the small details of your life, it's more than just observation. It's a choice. What do you think that choice means? Is it kindness, or is it a form of control? Let me know your theories. The fragile peace of their new routine was shattered by the arrival of a man who smiled too much. His name was Vincent Delacroix, and he was introduced by Madame Dubois as a cousin of Monsieur Lefebvre's late wife. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, and his warmth felt like a thin layer of ice over something dark and cold. He arrived one afternoon while Lena was polishing the grand piano in the main salon. Naomi was with her, drawing at a small table nearby. Vincent entered the broad room with an air of breezy ownership, his smile fixed and brilliant. And who is this little artist? He asked, his voice smooth as silk. He crouched, down by Naomi's table, looking at her drawing. Remarkable. You have a true gift. Naomi shrank back, pressing herself against Lena's leg. Lena felt a primal urge to shield her, to pull her away from this man's cloying charm. His eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were sharp and calculating. They held none of Julien's quiet contemplation. They were actively searching, assessing. You must be the new cleaner, he said, straightening up. Julien is so private. It's a surprise to see he's allowed such a domestic presence in the house. Again. The implication was clear. A subtle, venomous dart. Just then, Julien appeared in the archway. He didn't make a sound, but the atmosphere in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees. The air crackled. Vincent's smile didn't falter, but a tension tightened the corners of his eyes. Julien. I was just admiring the work of this talented young lady. Julien's gaze went from Vincent to Lena, and then settled on Naomi, who was in us, peeking out from behind her mother's uniform. He gave her the smallest, most private of nods. It was a gesture of reassurance, a silent promise. Vincent, Julien said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. Your visit is unexpected. Family should not have to make an appointment, Vincent replied, his tone light, but the words were a challenge. I was in the neighborhood. I heard you've made some changes. I see the rumors are true. Julien took a deliberate step forward, subtly positioning himself so he was slightly in front of Lena and Naomi. It was a small movement, but it was a clear demarcation, a line being drawn. The only change, Vincent, Julien said, his eyes locked on his, is that my patience for unannounced guests has grown thin. The politeness was gone. This was the crime boss the city whispered about. The Pertrulas Threat was no longer veiled. It was bare, cold, and lethal. Vincent's smile finally thinned. He gave a slight, mocking bow. Of course. I wouldn't want to intrude. He glanced one last time at Lena, a look that promised this was not over, before he turned and left the room. Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her hand clamped tight on Naomi's shoulder. She looked at Julian, who was still standing like a sentinel between her and the empty doorway. He hadn't protected his cleaner. He had protected them. That night, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows of the great house, the wind howling a mournful song. Lena had stayed late, unable to face the thought of walking to the bus stop in the deluge. She was in the kitchen wiping down the last of the counters when Julian found her. He was standing in the doorway again, a silhouette against the dim light of the Prosprosen hall. The doorway moment. It was becoming their place. The threshold between their two worlds. He was holding the drawing. The first one, the one Naomi had, dropped in his study. I have been thinking about this, he said, his voice barely louder than the whinny drumming of the rain. He walked toward her, stopping at the other side of the steel island. He placed the drawing between them. Her father, he said. It wasn't a question. Lena's hands stilled. She looked at the drawing, at the childishly rendered scar. His name was Marcus, she said, her voice quiet but steady. He was a soldier. He died in Afghanistan before she was born. He had a scar from an IED, a piece of shrapnel, they said. Right here. She instinctively touched the spot by her own eye. Julian's gaze followed her finger. He was unnervingly still, his own face a mask of shadow and light. It was just a coincidence, she whispered, more to herself than to him. She saw you, and she saw the hero from her drawings. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. The only sounds were the storm and the hum of the refrigerator. It is not a coincidence, he said, his voice thick with a texture she'd never heard before. Grief. For the first time, the narrative lens shifted just for a moment, pulling away from Lena and focusing on him. He wasn't seeing the kitchen. He was seeing a street in another city, years ago. The screech of tires. The impossible bloom of fire and shattered glass. The specific, searing pain as something sharp sliced the skin near his eye. The last thing he saw, before he blacked out, was his wife's face, serene, even in chaos. The scar wasn't from a battle. It was from the car bomb that had killed his wife. The same kind of violence, half a world away, had made them both solitary, connected, them in a way neither could have imagined. When Lena looked at him again, she saw it. The grief he kept locked behind his perfect composure was there in the sudden vulnerability of his eyes. He slowly raised a hand, not to his own scar, but reaching across the island toward her. His fingers hovered in the air, inches from her cheek, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from them. It held more intimacy, more raw emotion than any actual touch could have. He wanted to comfort her, but he was a man who had forgotten how. The moment stretched, fragile and profound. Then his hand dropped. The world, he said softly, is a cruel circle. The next day, the air was washed clean by the storm, but the feeling of dread returned, sharper than ever. As Lena and Naomi left the estate that evening, the sun casting long shadows across the perfect lawn, a sleek black car pulled up beside them on the private road. The window slid down with a silent hum. It was Vincent Delacroix, his smile predatory. "Good evening," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "This is a long walk to the bus stop for such little legs. Allow me to give you a ride." Lena's blood ran cold. She pulled Naomi closer, her arm a steel band around her daughter's small shoulders. "No, thank you," she said, her voice tight. "We enjoy the walk." "I insist," Vincent said, his smile widening, showing too many teeth. "It's no trouble. In fact, it would give us a chance to talk. I feel we got off on the wrong foot." His eyes bored into her, and she knew this wasn't an offer. It was a threat wrapped in courtesy. The road was deserted. The house was a distant silhouette behind them. They were utterly exposed. I said no, Lena repeated, her voice shaking despite her resolve. She turned, ready to walk away, to run if she had to, pulling a confused Naomi with her. Vincent's expression darkened. The mask of politeness was gone. He was about to say something else, perhaps even open his door, when a figure detached itself from the shadows of the great cypress trees lining the road. It was Serge. He moved with an unnatural silence for a man his size, simply appearing at their side like an apparition. He didn't look at Vincent. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet lethality. His presence was a sparf, statement more powerful than any weapon. Vincent stared at Serge for a long, hard moment. A silent battle of wills played out in the evening air. Finally, Vincent's lips tightened into a thin line. He looked at Lena one last time, his eyes promising retribution, before the window slid up and the car sped away, its tires spitting gravel. Serge remained, his gaze fixed on the disappearing car. Then he turned his head, slightly, and gave Lena a single, brief nod. He fell into step a few paces behind them and escorted them all the way to the bus stop, standing in silence until the bus arrived and they were safely on it. As the bus pulled away, Lena looked back and saw him still standing there, a solitary guardian under the street lamp's orange glow. The message was unequivocal. She was no longer just the cleaner. She and Naomi were under the protection of the Lefebvre syndicate, and that, she was beginning to understand, was both a comfort and a cage. This is the moment everything changes. She's no longer an outsider. She's a piece on the board. Do you think Julien is protecting her out of genuine care, or is she just a new asset he needs to secure? The line is so blurry. I'd love to hear what you think is truly in his heart. He was waiting for her in his study, the room where it all began. The air was still, just as it had been that first day, but this time, the silence was not empty. It was filled with everything that had passed between them since. Lena stood in the doorway, her hands clutching the strap of her bag. Julien was behind his desk, but he wasn't working. He was just watching her, his face calm, his eyes intense. "Come in, Lena," he said. He had never used her first name before. It sounded strange, intimate, in the vast, cold room. She stepped inside, closing the door, softly behind her. "Vincent will not bother you again," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "But he will not stop. He looks for leverage, a weakness he can use against me." Lena's throat was dry. "And he thinks we are your weakness." Julien rose from his chair and walked around the desk to stand in front of her. He was close, but not touching, close enough that she could see the faint silver line of his scar, the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "He is not entirely wrong," he admitted, his voice quiet. "To care for something is to create a vulnerability. This is the first rule of my world." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the space between them. "I have not cared for anything in a very long time." The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. This was more than an explanation. It was a baring of his soul. "He thinks you are a liability," Julien continued, his gaze unwavering, complication to be removed. "He is wrong. You are the first thing that has made sense in years." There it was. Not a declaration of love, not a passionate plea. It was something quieter, deeper, and more honest. It was a statement of fact from a man who dealt only in absolutes. He was the feared crime boss, a man who moved pieces on a board of power and violence. And she, the cleaner, had become the center of his game. "I cannot protect you if you are out there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the city beyond the window. "I can only protect what is mine." The word hung there. Mine. It was possessive, dangerous, and in that moment, it was the most comforting word Lena had ever heard. "I am not asking you to be my cleaner anymore," he said. "I am asking you to stay. You and Naomi. Here, with me." It wasn't a command. For the first time, he was giving her a choice. A choice to step out of the rain and into the heart of the storm, to trade a life of quiet, struggle for one of gilded danger. She looked into his eyes and saw not a crime, boss, but a man drowning in a quiet grief, reaching for a lifeline. And she realized she was reaching back. Lena didn't answer with words. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. Relief, profound and quiet, washed over Julian's features, softening the hard lines around his eyes. A silent contract was sealed, not of employment, but of belonging. A few minutes later, the study door creaked open. Naomi peeked inside, her red backpack slung over one shoulder. She saw her mother standing with Julian, and a slow smile spread across her face. She walked in, not with the explosive energy of that first day, but with a quiet confidence. She went to Julian and held up a piece of paper. It was a new drawing. This one was different. It showed 3 figures. A tall man with a silver line by his eye, a woman in a blue dress, and a small girl with a red backpack. They were all holding hands, standing under a sprawling green tree. Julian took the drawing from her, his fingers tracing the crayon figures. For the first time since Lena had met him, something that was almost a smile touched his lips. The final scene did not take place in the cold study or the formal salons. It took place in the kitchen. Days later, the room was filled with late afternoon sun, the kind of golden, hazy light that makes memories. Flour dusted every surface. Lena was showing Naomi how to knead dough on a large wooden board, her hands guiding her daughter's small ones. The air smelled of yeast and sugar, of warmth and home. Julian stood in the doorway, unseen by them, simply watching. He was no longer a monument of grief and power, but a man on the precipice of a new life. He watched Lena laugh, a real, unrestrained sound that filled the sterile kitchen with a life it had never known. He watched Naomi, her face a mask of concentration, her hands covered in dough. He was the head of the Lefebvre Syndicate, a man whose name inspired fear. But in this room, he was just here. The threat of Vincent, of his entire world, still lingered outside the walls of this house. Their future was not a fairy tale. It would be complicated and it would be dangerous. But as he watched the woman and the child who had broken through his stillness, he knew with an absolute certainty that for the first time in a very long time, he was not alone. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. And so their story starts not with a kiss, but with flour on their hands and a present Coman's child's drawing of a family. What happens when the cold, dangerous world outside, that kitchen, tries to break in? That's a story for another day. If you want to, be there when it unfolds. Make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The quiet is over.